Good afternoon. We're about to start. Wonderful. My name is Jocelyn Sargent. I'm the Executive Director of the Hyams Foundation here in Boston. I'd like to first say welcome to Boston. I am a new Bostonian of sorts, new-ish, that's what I mean. I've been here less than a year, still trying to get used to the traffic. I don't know what many of you thought getting here, but I am told I do not drive like a Bostonian, and I can't ever be sure if that's a compliment or an insult. So, Hyams is pleased to support youth-driven organizing that works to transform systems that at present do not produce the equitable outcomes for young people, particularly racially marginalized youth. One example of the way that Hyams supports the work is on school climate and zero tolerance discipline policies. For example, we support Boston Student Advisory Committee, or as we call them, BSAC, to reform school codes of conduct and other policy changes that make youth engagement more beneficial to the educational experiences that they are having. Why do we do this? How schools have exercised zero tolerance discipline was disproportionate. The BPS's out of school suspension rates were higher for students of color. And in 2013 to 2014, 5.5% suspensions of all students was the rate, but for students of color, for black students in particular, it was 8.4%. That's 4 times greater than their white peers, which was at around 1%. And for Latinos, the rate was 2.6% higher. 2.5 times higher. So we think that when that's happening, kids are getting a disproportional experience at school, and we want all kids to have equitable education outcomes. So through organizing with their peers, youth press for change, responding to community voices, systems do change. And so that reminds me of a book that's out now. It's called When We Fight, We Win. And that was given out at the Schott Foundation's 25th anniversary. I was very excited to see that. But now at BPS, we're using alternatives to discipline to school exclusion and expulsion. And so I do feel like when the young people fight, we all win. The times we are in call upon us to really hear and listen to the expertise of young people. Young people are typically not seen in the decision-making processes. Our expectation is that as young people tell us about the experiences they are having in the school system, we make school policy better for generations going forward, as well as outcomes for all people. And now I want to hand you over to Steve Patrick from the Aspen Institute, and I want to thank you again for your attendance here.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is an exciting gathering, and we're pleased to be doing this with so many of you at a moment when it feels like we have to figure out ways to strengthen our democracy, to push for greater participation, and to achieve the ideal that could be America. And so, we at the Forum for Community Solutions, we think about community change, and just in our name, the work is really about how communities coalesce to tackle their most pressing challenges. And everything we do is through an equity and justice lens. And so as we were thinking about this convening for the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund that Monique Miles leads, and we were thinking about the convening for the Collective Impact Forum, we felt like those were really important, but that there was some fierce urgency of now around what's happening in real time in our communities, and in particular for and with our young people. And so that's why we asked you all to gather for kind of a roundtable conversation. It's hard to do a roundtable from up here, but we'll make it work. We will have a conversation today. And a lot of this is about kind of the moment we're in, where if we agree that society's most important role is to create belonging, we're in a moment in our country where othering seems to be gaining some momentum. And maybe even beyond othering, extreme othering like demonizing and criminalizing at a time when we collectively may feel like we've made some progress. And so this gathering, our vision for it at the Forum for Community Solutions is about really understanding that Dr. King was right and that the arc of the moral universe does bend towards justice. But as far as we can tell, those who have been pushing on that bend have been young people in this country ever since we've begun the march towards progress, towards inclusion, towards equity, towards fairness. And so it felt right in this time to join together with the folks who are supporting the folks who are on the front lines of youth-led change in the country. And so I just want to acknowledge our partners in this. First, Hyams, Jocelyn, and team. Amazing that we just sort of threw this idea out and they jumped on it and really co-created it with us. It was not a grant to then do the work. It was, hey, we're going to bring our best to bear, and it's really been a great partnership. Thank you, Hyams. FCYO, the Funding Collaborative for Youth Organizing. How many of you are FCYO members? Just let me see. Well, we need to dramatically increase those numbers. That was 17% of the room. That's just, we got to go up. So that's great. FCYO, I want to thank you guys for keeping this movement going. There have been, in a time of intense theories of change in philanthropy, funding young people around the issues they care about sometimes get lost in the PowerPoint slides, and FCYO has kept hope alive for the youth-led change movement in this country. Grantmakers concerned with immigrants and refugees, GSER, thank you for helping us pull this together. We are a grant maker at the Forum for Community Solutions, so after the election, we just felt like we should join GSER. That was like the first thing we did as a grant maker. And how many of you are members of Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees? That's better. That's 26% of the room. That's good. That's good. These partners will be with us today, and you'll get to learn more about their work. I also want to thank the Center for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute for their partnership. And last, the Ford Foundation and Soros, OSF. It's really exciting to see momentum at Ford in particular right now. David Barth's team thinking about youth opportunity, youth-led change. There was a time when Ford recently wasn't in the youth space, and they're jumping back in with both feet, and it is super exciting to see that. Thank you. And Ken Zimmerman, thank you, and OSF. This was one of those things where Ken reached out and said, hey, this is the kind of stuff we've historically been a part of, and our answer was like, awesome, will you moderate the panel? So here he is. And so without further ado, well, one other ado, tremendous appreciation is due Sherry Brady from the Forum for Community Solutions for putting this together. Sherry put this together because she got off a conference call first. You know what happens, right? We're a small but mighty team. Sherry hung up first, and now we have this. It's beautiful. Thank you, Sherry. So now, without further ado, I'd like to call up Ken Zimmerman and the panelists. Y'all come on up, and let's start this conversation with the folks who were here to support and recognize and follow their leadership on. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Steve. Come on up. Hey, how you doing? Good afternoon, everyone. I'll tell you, for a round table, this doesn't look like a round table up here, but we're going to do our best. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Jocelyn. The phrase, nothing about us without us, seems like the right starting point for this really important kickoff to a couple of days' conversation. We are starting with the right set of people, a bunch of youth organizers, and I'm really proud to facilitate a conversation, mostly so you can hear from them. Steve did ask me to make a few preliminary remarks, and maybe to help them understand who they're talking to. By a show of hands, can I see how many folks fund youth organizing? That's great. And keep your hands up. How many folks fund other forms of youth programs or youth development? And how many other folks are funders who are just here because they see this sounds really important? Come on, everybody raise your hands to show the support. Oh, yeah, thank you. See, everybody out there is here to support you. So briefly, what Steve asked me to do is just reflect from the perspective of the Open Society Foundations, why youth organizing? Why youth? I mean, there are a set of cliches about why we should all invest in youth. Youth are our future. Youth continue to challenge us and get us out of our conventional bubbles. Youth actually understand things like social media and new approaches to issues. Is that true? You guys, okay, great. All of those cliches, I think, are true, but I don't think they're sufficient to explain why youth organizing matters. I mean, it's worth reflecting that Ralph Abernathy, nope, I still didn't get it right, Dr. King were under 32 when they founded the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Jody Chamberlain, in her 20s, founded, in many respects, and drove the disability rights movement. Sylvia Rivera was still a teenager when she helped organize Stonewall. So when we think back in terms of the social change that's occurred, it's no accident that we think about youth as a driving force, because in this country, most of the most profound social movements have been led and pushed and driven by youth. And that's something I think it's important for all of us to come back to. At OSF, and I'll offer a few examples just for other funders to think about, even though most of you have your own examples that I'm looking forward to hearing about and I'm sure equally powerful. But United We Dream, which we'll hear a little bit more about, was something that changed the face of what the immigrant issues were seen as perceiving. And as we think about from an OSF perspective, how you take local leadership, how you take youth-led leadership, and help it transform into something that's not just a single buzz, but is actually an institution capable of changing a national narrative, we increasingly see ways that by investing in youth, that can happen. Similarly, an alternative approach, and I'm here with my colleagues, Lenny Noisette and Gretchen Rohr, and if you can just raise your hands, they'll be around for the next couple of days. OSF, is part of our fight to end mass incarceration, has something that some of you may be familiar with, the Soros Justice Fellowship Program, something we're very proud of, that is investing in people who've actually pushing the envelope in terms of what needs to be done to address incarceration. This year, for the first time, in partnership with what we call our youth exchange within OSF, we have a youth cohort, 7 different individuals who represent youth in advancing the forefront of change in criminal justice reform, including, for the first time, I think our youngest ever Soros Justice Fellow, a 19-year-old who's at the forefront of restorative justice in her own community. And then finally, to give you an example for those who are involved in different kinds of work, prior to the election, we actually created in North Carolina a program focused on African-American millennials out of the belief that the existing political system had not fully invested in making sure that they had the opportunity to engage in civic engagement, engaged in voting, and recognize that there were different approaches that needed to be done. All of you have your own examples. They're equally powerful. I mentioned them, and I'm happy with my colleagues to talk about them more. Ford certainly has been a leader in this space historically. To actually answer the question of why engaging in youth. The real answer, of course, is here. But the idea that youth are the vanguard of social change, I hope, is something that all of us can see, and I think we will hear more as to the ways in which all of that plays out. So without further ado, let me, you've got their bios in the materials, but I'll just ask each of our panelists just to talk briefly about who you are, what you do, what the successes and challenges are, and we'll have a conversation in the 64 minutes that we still have left for this conference. You should know it's somewhat intimidating. There's a big clock here with red letters that's shining in our face, so, you know, bear with us. Carlos Saavedra with the Ari Institute, did I pronounce that right? I'll ask him to start. Savina Tapia, then ask Trenton Casillas-Bakeberg, who's making his inaugural visit to Boston, and then Lashon Amado. So, Carlos, if you could introduce yourself and explain the power of youth organizing.
How much time do I have?
About 2 or 3 minutes to now.
Oh.
We'll have a conversation from there.
Okay, cool. Just asking. Oh, wow, that's loud. So my name is Carlos Saavedra. I am here from Boston, but I'm originally from Lima, Peru. And just briefly to tell you a little bit about myself, now I'm going to be 31 this year, so I'm not doing youth organizing anymore, but I had some experiences in the last 15 years, particularly with immigrant young people, with the movement of the Dreamers that fought for a long time, and I was very glad to be part of that process since being in high school in a youth program, then forming an organization called the Student Immigrant Movement here in Boston, then leading the United We Dream Network for about 4 years, running all across the country, travel about 20 to 30 days for about 4 to 5 years. You know, and of course succeeding in winning the Deferred Action Program that legalized at this point almost 1 million young people, which at that time, and actually until today, we could say is the largest victory of the immigrant rights movement in the last 30 years. So that's been my experience doing community organizing, doing political involvement. Thank you. Well, and I'm just one person out of all the people, of course, that did all that. And that's been my experience. Yeah, so I hope that we can have a dialogue, particularly about youth organizing in the field. I spent a lot of time not just thinking about it, but doing it and failing at it, and having some small successes at it. So I hope that we can have a dialogue about its strengths and its limitations, because there's limitations to it as well.
Great, and we'll come back. One of the questions that we'll talk about, since there are mostly funders in the audience, are lessons that you think people who are interested and committed to this, but who are funding it, should keep in mind, since I think we accept that there are successes and failures, but there are ways in which funders can help support, and also sometimes ways that funders can get in the way of doing what needs to be done. But Savina, tell us a little bit about your experience.
My experience, so I'm a second-year law student at American University. I'm majoring in law and society, and I can credit that to BSAC and Youth on Board. BSAC and Youth on Board instilled in me this drive for equity. I bounced around throughout Boston school system a lot throughout my K through 12 education. I went from parochial school to charter school and bounced right back into public school. And in high school, throughout student government, I reflected on my different experiences throughout those 3 different types of school, and I wondered, why wasn't I getting the same type of education at every single school? Why were my parents choosing me to send me somewhere else and not the schools that were in my community? And I realized I had big role, equity had a big role in that. And it was through BSAC and Youth on Board where I became engaged with our equity campaign and trying to figure out why our public schools were considered failing, not good, when in reality, they're what we need. And from there, I got involved in a multitude of campaigns. There's Student Vote campaign, which pushed to have the Boston School Committee, which I sat on, to have a voting student member, because it made no sense to have a school committee that had a student on it, but the student wasn't allowed to vote on policy. I had a voice, but I was just a token. I sat there. I didn't really make any change. And from there, our campaigns just grew into a multitude of other things. And as a fresh alumni, I graduated 2016 from Latin Academy. I've continued to to work through BSAC as a satellite down in DC, and this past March, actually, I met with the Secretary of Education to discuss what well-rounded education was like and how youth organizing has played a role in that.
Great, and we'll come back. Great. Let me see. I think that Trenton, you're up. Can you introduce yourself? And
sure. Hami Takiapi, Trenton Casillas-Bakeberg Amado, Ina Denise Casillas Amado, Ate Lebeau Amado, Wambli Paha Elwati. My name is Trenton Casillas-Bakeberg, and my mother is Denise Casillas, and my father is Lebeau Bakeberg, and I live in Eagle Butte, South Dakota, on the Cheyenne River Reservation there. And I'm 21 years old, and I've been working with the One Mind Youth Movement, which I co-founded shortly after I graduated high school. I mean, it took a while for it to come together because it was just bouncing around, after I graduated high school, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew that there were things that needed to be changed in my community. And so it's been about 2 years now, going on 3, and we've worked collaboratively to push the issues that our community faces and projects that we feel could help resolve those issues, to our tribal council. And that way we can make this positive impact, which one of the projects that we're working on is a youth safe house that's been a vision for about 2 years now. And it's taken time for the project policies to be written, the positions to be made, and right now we're working on getting a list of things that we need, because the building is there now. It's a building that we're going to move into soon, and that was our project. For the first year, we were setting the groundwork for our organization and our priorities and what we wanted to work on, which is youth suicide prevention, environmental justice, and making an emphasis on treaty rights and water rights, which also leads into, the next year of our organization taking to the front lines of the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And wow, there's a lot to be said about that. I was there. My friends were the ones that led the charge. They did the youth run to Washington, D.C. along with some youth from Standing Rock. And it was really profound to be a part of that with them. And we were camped out in North Dakota, for several months. I only live an hour away from where the camp was, so I would camp out for a couple weeks and go back home and just go back and forth. And all around, it was a really traumatizing experience facing off with, a militia of highly militarized police. They basically had a small army there to enforce, the construction of this pipeline on peaceful people who just didn't want the threat of getting our water polluted. And now, according to the news, the pipeline's been completed, and my community and all the other communities around, we live with the constant threat of our fresh drinking water being polluted at any time, just because some people, high up in the corporation wanted to make some money. And sorry, I get real emotional talking about that. I can't imagine, if that day comes. So after the things, the events in North Dakota that happened, our focus shifted back to our community, and it strengthened us as a group. And now not only are we the One Mind Youth Movement, some of our members are a part of, including myself, we're a part of the International Indigenous Youth Council, which was founded in September, at the camps. And I remember meeting in a teepee around a fire. We were talking about not only the issues that we face in the camp, but the issues that we face in our own communities back home, because we knew that eventually we would have to go back home and face those again. And it's been a long journey, and it's going to be a long one after this, but I'm really grateful to be here, so thank you.
And Trenton, thank you for bringing your own language in, which is how you started, and it's really important, I think, for you to be able to present that voice here, so thank you for doing that as well. Lashon, love to hear about what you have done, what you've brought, successes and challenges.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I'm from Boston, so I'm proud to have you guys in my city. I think I was forced into the social justice world due to the injustices that I experienced myself, and also the injustices that I witnessed others in my community suffer from. For example, I remember being 13 years old, walking home from school, and being humiliated, treated in the most unfair manner by the police in my community. And I just remember asking the police officer, why are you patting me down in front of all these people? And they said, oh, because you fit a profile. So immediately I felt how powerless I was in this system, right? In addition to my being through the Boston public school systems, I remember being at my middle school graduation and asking myself, how did you get here? You didn't work, you didn't earn for this. You didn't earn this degree. And it was then that I realized that the school system was pushing me along. They didn't care about me, they just wanted to pass me along to high school. So due to all these injustices, I realized something has to change, and I realized that it was a systems issue. And with systems, you got to understand it. You have to educate yourself in order to dismantle it. And again, I was most passionate about criminal justice, from being harassed by police, by giving a criminal record, not being able to get a job, and reintegrate into society as society expected me to. So I studied criminal justice, even though everyone was in my face saying, why are you studying criminal justice? You have a record, you'll never get nowhere. I still took that risk because I knew that I needed to understand this system that was oppressing me and my peers. So I used education as a vehicle to sort of emerge into the social justice space. I learned about how the court system pressures young men to take pleas, even when they're most likely going to be found innocent. They put the pressure on the young men to cop out and take on these sentences when they would have been found innocent in the long run. So learning little things like that really empowered me to go on. So I took my leadership to a whole nother level and started serving on my state state advisory group, which is authorized through JJDPA, which is a piece of legislation with 4 core protections that protect juveniles in incarceration. You can give it a pretty title, but they're incarcerated. So I work with city officials enforcing those 4 core values, but then I was offered the opportunity to take my voice to a national level through my work with Opportunity Youth United, which is a national movement of opportunity youth who have a set of policy recommendations to inform society on what it would take to not only reconnect 1 million youth a year, but to also address the conditions in the community, the conditions that are tearing apart these communities that these young people live in, that I live in, and in the community that you're in right now. Because right down the street, yeah, we're downtown, but a few blocks down is Saavedra Ave, where actually the 2 young men who Aaron Hernandez was accused of killing were shot. So, you guys are a couple of blocks away from reality. So that's what sort of forces me into this space, just seeing it every day, learning more about the system, and just being frustrated with the sense of powerlessness that I felt before.
Thank you for your work. So I'd like each of you to talk a little bit more about the organizing part of what you did. I mean, each of you are leaders in your own right, and it's wonderful having you here. But partly what you did was combine with others in your community to start to make a difference. And, as a young person, that takes certain courage, it takes a certain vision of what you want to do. And I'd like to ask each of you to reflect on that a little bit. How was it that you went from experiencing something to trying to translate it into making change with others? So maybe I can start with you, Carlos.
Yeah. Well, I came when I was 12, as I said. My parents came here. We were the last family of my whole family to come here. And of course, we are from Lima, Peru, and my grandparents are migrants from the provinces of Peru to the city. I mean, it's a whole history of migration, just our whole lives, to try to figure out how to have a different means of being better. But when I came here, and I was in high school, and I came when I was 12, maybe when I was 16 years old, I was trying to figure out whether I was undocumented or not, because my parents didn't really talk about it too much. Like, my mom told me about it when I was very young, that we were undocumented, and even my grandfather died a year from the time that we were here, and nobody could go to see him. My mother and his sisters listened to the funeral from the phone. So I kind of understood that there were consequences to being undocumented, but I wasn't really aware fully in a young age. But when I was 16, a high school teacher brought us together and he said, if you come to this class or this set of meetings in the afternoon, I will give anybody an A, history teacher, from East Boston High School here, just 15 minutes on the T. So of course, I didn't really like school, so I went to the meeting. And and he started talking about what does it mean to be undocumented and all these things. And most people, their parents had actually lied to them, that they were in an immigration, either having some process or that they were documented or they were born here. But most people were undocumented, either Salvadorian, Colombian, Peruvian, we were all undocumented. So that for me, the question became quite clear because the whole premises of my parents coming here was for me to go to college. And I am the oldest brother, the oldest cousin, and the oldest whatever you can find. I am amazed about that. That's not a good for an immigrant. That's not a good thing. So I said, well, what does it mean to be undocumented? And we found out, of course, that we couldn't afford tuition here. That's almost 12 years ago. They will charge us triple the tuition. So to go to UMass, we have to pay $22,000 instead of paying maybe $6,000. My mother is a domestic worker. My dad is a janitor. There's no way we could afford that. So we were like, well, this makes no sense. So actually, I tried to quit school for a while because we were broke and I wanted to go work. My parents wouldn't let me because of this whole premises that I had to go to college. But my peers and in youth organizing, we started forming a group at that time, and we did a campaign to go get this thing called the in-state tuition bill so that we can get the local tuition, residential, and go to school. So we went for 3 years to the State House, hundreds of meetings with legislators. We went to like 80 high schools and talked to students. I come from a very working class neighborhood in Peru, so I didn't really like politicians. I always thought they were always lying, my basic assumption. So I would lie back to them, particularly because they would ask you, what career do you want to have? So I will read their bios, and I will say, this guy studied journalism or lawyer. So I will just tell them that, A couple of times they caught me on a lie when you have two legislators, and so I will just tell them, I'm still deciding, it's a rough path. So I graduated high school in 2004, and we managed to pass this in-state tuition bill through the House and the Senate. And it was crazy. My uncles in Peru were like, I don't understand how you don't have documents, but you can pass laws. That makes no sense. And maybe about a week later, Mitt Romney vetoed the legislation, and I couldn't go to school. At that time, I wanted to play classical piano. That was what I wanted to do, so I couldn't really go. I went to Bunker Hill Community College, but it was like you take a class every year or whatever. If with the work and everything, I used to be a busboy in one of the restaurants here in Newberry Street. So I was frustrated, and I was being a busboy between 10 a.m. and 1 a.m. for a while. And one day I talked to my father, and my dad was a soccer player in Peru. And I don't know how is the relationship with your parents or with your dads particularly, but anytime I ask my dad for an advice, he tells me a soccer story. Everything is a soccer story, if it's faith, it's something with Jesus and the ball or whatever. I still do not understand how that works. So I asked my dad, because what happened is we lost the campaign, and then the organization kind of destroyed. A lot of people left. There was a lot of failure perceived. So I missed all the community. So I went and asked my dad, Dad, I don't know what's going on. We don't have the community anymore. What do you think is happening? Give me some advice. And he said to me, Carlos, it's because you're playing a game, but you don't have a team. So I was like, Dad, I just don't understand what you're talking about, He told me a whole soccer story for 30 minutes. I was still trying to grasp it. But he said to me, essentially, when you run one single campaign, you're just playing one game. And when people come to play one game, they're interested just in winning, but when they lose, they leave. But when they're into an organization, into a community, when they're into a team, even if they fail, they will stick together, And he told me something I will never forget, which is and there's a way about how to fail. Because you can fail and really fail, which is if you don't learn from your mistakes. So that really got me. I was like, oh my God, my dad finally told me a soccer story that I understand. This makes sense. I suffered through these narratives for my whole life. They make sense now. So I quit my job as a busboy, and we started an organization called the Student Immigrant Movement. That was almost 11 years ago, to try to organize young people, talk to people. I have no clue what organizing meant, to be honest with you. You just talk to people and try to figure out issues like that. And a couple of years later, I was very frustrated at the things that we couldn't achieve on the state. So we went to form an organization called United We Dream. As I said before, traveled 20 out of 30 days to open up teams everywhere, sleeping in people's couches, eating great Mexican food. That's the best thing in the Immigrant movement. And essentially confront the government for a period of 4 to 5 years. I think every youth organizing experience is very different because of the political context that we come in. So there's a different level of segregation, right? If you're talking from a context of immigrants, we're stateless people that are not even from here, right? We're from other places, either native or non-native or mixed, that are coming to understand a context with a particular narrative about the American dream, right? And so that's the context that we were facing. We were able to build a lot of teams, but we suffered a lot of failures. We lost the DREAM Act, which was a law that would legalize us in 2010. And the same thing happened. The organization started kind of breaking apart. Have to bring it back together. And in 2012, and I'll end with this, we had no support in Congress. So somebody found out that we didn't need Congress to get some sort of legalization. And we found out because somebody was a John Lennon fan, particularly, and found out that John Lennon had this thing called administrative relief that the government just granted him because he was a rich hippie, essentially. And we said, well, why can we get that level of legal aid for us? And of course, we proceeded to confront President Obama in 2012 and 11, which was his re-election. Everybody on the progressive movement didn't really talk to us for those 2 years because Mitt Romney was going to win and all those things. But gladfully, 6 months before, we were able to succeed and win deferred action. Now, I hope we can talk later about the experiences. I think now there's dreamer groups all across the country. There's hundreds of them. When I was in high school, we couldn't talk about it. Now people talk about it all the time. There's movies, there is, again, student groups. There's tons of states that have passed laws to aid us, you know. There's scholarships. My brother that is undocumented has a driver's license. He went to China 2 years ago. Like there's a whole set of opportunities that it is. And in the immigrant rights movement, you cannot talk, or even within the Democratic Party, you cannot talk about immigrant rights without talking about this constituency that we just literally made up, called the Dreamers, that 15 years ago didn't really exist. So that was part of my experience with it. And of course, there's a lot of lessons that we can talk later about.
That's great. I love that phrase of playing a game but not having a team, which in many respects speaks to what I think each of you represent. Lashon, I mean, you also have been at it for a period of time. Can you talk about how you translated your personal experience into starting to develop a team in the work that you did?
Very similar to his experience. He said two things that resonated with me, which is power and passion. Like I said, I didn't really grow up as an organizer. I sort of just started talking to people. And that's what I've learned in organizing Opportunity Youth. Opportunity Youth have taken on this title as hardest to reach. They don't care. But what I learned was when you talk to them, they have all the ideas, and then their power is sort of unleashed. And so taking that, you know, we recognize that, you know, in each of the communities that we work with, we need to work with the young leaders to, one, identify what it is that they care about in the community, and then educate them on what they need to do to bring about that change, right? We're not here to tell you who to vote for, how to do it. We're just here to educate you on this is how the system works, and if you want to make change, here's how you make it happen. Because if you have the power, if you feel that power, your passion will allow you to learn everything that you need to do along the way. So like I said, I had to learn the system in order to be effective. We need to pass that torch forward and educate our young people again on how to bring their vision for communities to life. And it starts with education. Because at bare minimum, young people don't even realize that a lot of the issues that they care about are decided at the local level, right? They're so worried about the president and all these other things, but the president doesn't come parachuting into your community if someone gets shot in your community or if there's a pothole. So just like that bare minimum piece of education sort of enlightens young people, and even just asking them, what do you care about? What's one thing I usually start the conversation is, what's one thing you would change in your community? They go on and on and on and on and on and on. So like I said, we just take that power in that moment and just train them up. And then they're able to take it and go out to the community and go out into the world and lead in different ways. Not just through civic engagement. We want them leading in philanthropy. We want them leading in corporations. We want them leading in all sectors that build power, right? Because if you're talking about youth power, we can't just build it politically. We need to make sure that we have young people infiltrating all these different systems that make up this ecosystem of power. And it takes training, it takes education, it takes all these different things. But it starts with the conversation. Yeah, I'll just kind of stop there.
No, I think that's really powerful. I mean, it's time of talking and listening and really engaging people where they are is, at the end of the day, the insight that I think is one for all of us to keep in mind, especially funders. So, Savina, I mean, you're fresher to it. You were nodding as you were listening to that. What led you to move from your personal experience into organizing in some form?
So my personal experience with organizing, I kind of just dove right in. BSAC and Youth on Board had just finished passing Mass Legislature 222, which was a piece of legislation that stated zero tolerance had to be eliminated from schools' codes of conduct across the state. And I remember walking into BSAC, and it was just a room full of other young people, and they were all just talking, like all the adults are sitting back like this, they're just watching, taking notes, like just helping facilitate a conversation. But everyone was talking, we need to do this, we need to do that, like what are our next steps? And BSAC was in the process of trying to create, BSAC and Youth were in the process of creating another campaign. And this one was more about experiences and stories and getting the word out that zero tolerance needs to end within our schools. And I popped in and I was like, oh, I have something to say. And Jenny said, share your story, what do you have to say? And I had been treated really unfairly as a student with a 504 and IEP plan. And I was told from my previous school, don't come back, we can't suit your needs here, you would be better in a different school. And from there, my story, I ended up getting involved with Dignity in Schools and going to the national level and talking about school push-out and the school-to-prison pipeline and the fact that since our schools don't have equity, that's going to continue to build the pipeline rather than dismantle it. And from there, staying within BSAC, I just got more involved in campaigns organically. From there, I got involved with the student voice and school climate. BSAC and Youth on Board have created a forum where students can rate their teachers on their skills, their interactions, and the functionings in the classroom, and then the overall school climate. What is it like to be in school? Because teachers and administrators and local and district leaders make the decisions without us, when in reality, we're the ones in the classrooms, we're the ones interacting with our teachers. I'm sitting there in a chair learning, while you're in your office and you're making decisions for me without knowing what I'm going through. That just didn't make any sense. And from there, I wasn't good on the ground, like flyering and just sitting down with people and having like these organic conversations didn't really work for me. But I found a different way to be engaged with Youth on Board and BSAC. And so I ended up working, BSAC also has like this, before I get into like how I worked, BSAC has this really unique not opportunity, but structure with Youth on Board. So Youth on Board is our external organization that helps us facilitate dialogues with our inside allies, which are local leaders, district administrators, and things like that. So we have direct access to those who are going to be making these political decisions affecting our schools and affecting our livelihoods. And with that type of relationship, I ended up sitting on the Boston School Committee, and I became a student political figure in a sense where I was channeling the voice of 57,000 students every Wednesday night at 6 p.m. and telling the district, this is what's going on in your schools. You think that's what's going on, but this is the reality. This is what's going on in your schools. Actually, this is what your students need. And you can't really make this decision without us and our voice, because if you don't, you're not accountable. There's no integrity there. You're not doing what's right for your students, because you're not asking us. We're not there. You're not coming to see what we're seeing, to feel what we're feeling. There was a period of time that I was really frustrated with the district, because we were being told that, oh, your adults are just telling you what to say. Like, you're not coming up with this information. You're not doing this research. We spent hours and hours on conference calls looking up information together. And to be discredited and misunderstood, it almost extinguished the fire in me. But then I was reminded that without being engaged in organizing, nothing's going to change and everything's going to remain the same. And youth are going to continue to suffer in ways that we shouldn't have. And being at the table makes a difference, and we see our change in action, especially with our app. The app was one of my, Boston Student Advisory and Youth on Board's student rights app was one of my first big projects with BSAC and Youth on Board. And from there, we sat and we developed an app in order to educate students on their rights within the district. And from there, that app just grew into a multitude of things, and we now have hate crime violations reporting system on there that goes directly to our district's Office of Equity, and that stemmed from racial tensions that were in the district. Black at BLS was a turning point for us, and having to realize that diversity was an issue within the school district, and in order to address that, we needed to do something about that. So we held our superintendent accountable, we held the Office of Equity accountable, and we now have a mechanism to report hate crimes that occur within our schools. And the app itself is a resource, a tool, and a system of educating students, parents, community members in a way that all of us can be connected at once. Everyone has a cell phone or a tablet or a computer in front of them at least for an hour a day. And it's a resource that's going to be right there in my hand when I need it at school. If I'm being told I'm being suspended because I spoke out of line, you can't just escort me out of the building and say I can't be in school because I spoke out of line. My right is right here. And from there, with our political climate and the other issues that are arising, we've added to the app. We now have undocumented student resources on there. We have resources for students who are facing like criminal sanctions and possible expulsions from their school. We have lawyers and other resources through that app. And from there, a lot of other campaigns and projects have developed. And so it's a ball, it's a snowball. Things just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we hope to take the app nationally so that other states and other students can have an app that connects them with each other and with their parents, and it educates them. It's a tool, it's there.
Great. So Trenton, I'm going to ask you I'm going to ask you the same question. I just want to put folks on notice. We'll talk for another 7 or 8 minutes. I've got one more question for everybody, but then we'd really like to invite questions or comments from those that are here and broaden the conversation beyond us. So please start thinking about what you'd like to contribute. But Trenton, same question. I mean, it's remarkable where you're trying to do, and just what led you to move from seeing a problem to trying to do something about it?
Well, my personal introduction to organizing was pretty cool. I mean, like I said, after I graduated high school, I know I didn't want to go to college right away because I needed to decide before I, potentially get myself in debt for something I'll change my mind about. But there was a community meeting that was, I saw a post on Facebook one time, and I thought it'd be cool to go check out. And I love meeting new people, meeting people with like minds who want to advocate for positive change in local communities. So I went to the meeting. It was at our local community college. And when I went to, the room where it was happening, I walked in and it was just all my friends, it's all young people. And then there was one older person. She's kind of the reason why our youth movement came together. Her name's Lebeau. And I'd like to give a shout out to her because she's awesome, and she's still been working on, the Safe House project with us this whole time. And yeah, I mean, like, we met and we talked about our different interests and, you know, what we think, you know, we could change in our communities. It was a real cool meeting. And my first interest in project that I pursued was a resolution to end the water fluoridation that was happening in my community. And I know fluoride is good for your teeth enamel, but when you put it in the municipal water supply, you know, you drink it and it doesn't just affect your teeth enamel, it collects in your body and calcifies certain glands in your endocrine system and really causes a lot of problems. You know, it could even cause dental fluorosis if you get too much and be detrimental to your teeth. And so when I was 18 years old, I started writing a resolution to pass into our tribal council, you know, to stop following the state mandated law saying that we needed fluoride in our water. By the time I was 19, I had finished writing that. It was my first legal document I ever wrote. And with my mom reached out to her friend, also her colleague who's a lawyer. I showed it to her and she made some well-needed revisions. You know, with that, I was able to take it to the district meetings in our local reservation. And, you know, it went to the tribal council, I believe, and I think it got passed or something. Something happened statewide where our water fluoridation isn't, you know, mandated in South Dakota anymore. You know, I don't think my resolution had anything to do with that, but, you know, if you have fluoride in your local community water, you should probably try to get it out because it's messing with your brain and your body, and it can, it's you know, officially classified by the FDA as a neurotoxin now, and it increases. I mean, there's been studies done where it's linked to ADHD and increased, you know, like problems. I don't know. Next topic. Yeah, you know, not only were we getting, you know, poisoned, but our community as a whole, you know, it's on a reservation. And there's this common preconception about reservations that, you know, we get lots of money from the government. We have no laws, like we're able to do whatever we want. And, you know, some of that's true, but, you know, like, unless you've actually been to a reservation, it's hard to really know what it's like there. And part of it has to do with, you know, right from the get-go, when my ancestors were forced onto the reservations, there was a socioeconomic oppression that existed ever since then. And it's resonated throughout the generations. My grandmother went to boarding school, and her mother went to boarding school. My mom went to boarding school, and it finally ended with my generation. And I went to regular, you know, public school, which, you know, with the Common Core curriculum, it was nice, but it doesn't teach us about our roots, our culture, where we come from. And so another part of our organization's focus is educational reform, which we're working towards, but among other things, you know, there's a lot of different things that need to be changed on a reservation alone. And we're hoping to create a ripple effect, you know, when we finally do, you know, start making like some noticeable effects, you know, like, because once we get the Youth Safe House, I believe that'll really help, you know, with our youth who, you know, come from a bad home, basically, you know, like, because of the historical trauma that has been passed down through the generations, a lot of families turn to alcohol abuse, drug abuse, any kind of substance that they can do to cope with the pain that was passed on to them from their parents and their parents' parents. It hasn't been dealt with, and now I believe that we're in a very pivotal moment in our history where we're transforming that, and we're sending this message out saying, you know, we need help. On a reservation, there's a lack of access to information and data and research because, you know, we just go unseen. Our voice isn't heard. And like I said before, I'm really grateful to be here, being able to share this message with you because we need help at home, and it's not going to stop until we make it. You know, we all need healing, and the world needs healing. Our earth is sick, and she has a fever. And if we don't stop the trajectory of where this whole consumeristic, capitalistic society is going, we might just be shaken off like a flea on a dog. Yeah.
So I'd like to ask each of you one final question, and then we'll open it up. It'll be a bit of a different question for each of you, but Trenton, I actually want to start with you. Okay. And this is less about the what that you did than the how you did it. I mean, you made reference, each of you did, about adults or others who were helpful to you. But when we think about youth organizing, one of the real challenges is how to provide authentic youth voice, but at the same time, figure out how adults can most help in terms of things they may have experienced on. I'm just curious, I mean, you talked about a couple of times where you went to a lawyer that you got access to. Do you have thoughts about what's most important when there are adults who want to be supportive of youth organizing, how they can do so constructively without at the same time necessarily undermining what the power is and what you talk about?
Yeah, well, it's always good to have mentors, you know, in the work that we do. As a young adult, there are times when I feel lost and I feel like I lose my footing or something, you know, like it's kind of hard to see the vision when the future is so far ahead, you know, as a young person. And I feel the same way for even younger people. As a child, you know, you see the world and you don't see the problems. And I remember there was a point in time when I thought the world was perfect and, you know, all these systems in place, the institutions around us were there to benefit us. And when the day came that I realized, you know, they're not here to benefit everyone. It took me a while to realize that, you know, and with the help of older people who have already experienced some of the problems in the world, you know, it finally came to my awareness that I need to help, you know, whatever this is, we need to change it in order to keep moving in history and you know, try to make something good happen for once, because there's just so much negativity on the planet already. You know, it's positiveness, you know, being positive about the future. And sometimes we have a hard time with that. I think that, you know, as a young person, hopeful for the future, we can inspire older people, adults, to, you know, feel the same way. And likewise, you know, adults who already feel that way can help, you know, the younger people who are already depressed or, you know, really not as hopeful about life because of the way things are. But, you know, we're all on the same planet here, and we're in this together no matter what. Whether you support whichever political party, whether you have a cool haircut or not, or like, you know what I mean. We're in this together, and it's good to relate with older people. You know, in our culture, our elders are held in very high esteem, regardless of how they treat us or anything. You know, like there's so much to learn from our elders, and not just our language, because, you know, my grandma, like, her generation is the last fluent speakers of Lakota, and so I'm learning from her. And you know, I'm also going to start taking classes this next semester at our local community college. But, you know, there's just so much to learn from our elders. And if you still have your grandparents, you know, like, take some time, call them, talk to them, ask them about their stories in their life, you know, share your stories. And it's a really beautiful thing. There's so many different possibilities for learning and growth when it comes to just older people, you know.
As an older person, I'm very relieved to hear that. So thank you for saying it. Even though I will say, I think the inspiration that you provide, and I spent a couple years as a civil rights lawyer working on one of the Lakota reservations. I mean, that inspiration that you bring is incredibly powerful. So really hope all of you hold it, because it means an enormous amount to everybody else. And Savina, I want to ask you a similar version of the same question. I mean, you were in a fairly significant position on the Boston School Committee, and you talked about the challenge of, on one hand, getting and taking advantage of expertise that came from others who'd been through that before, but also being very intent on holding on to your voice and not having it be diminished. What are the things we should take away from how to make sure that adults and others with expertise that you may not have had can support it, but without squelching it at the same time?
I think the one thing that comes to mind when thinking about that is having faith in the work that young people are doing. On school committee, while sitting on the school committee, all the members had faith in what I was doing because I was coming to the table with what I had in mind, what was good for the people, like the young people. And they believed it, because if I wasn't trying to work on improving our schools for our students and our young people, then I wouldn't be there. There wouldn't be a purpose of me being there. It could just be a bunch of committee members, and they're making the decisions. But I was there, and I had a voice, and they had faith in me, and they held me just as accountable as I held them for listening to me and me taking their advice. And from that idea of having faith in the work that we're doing extends just beyond like the position that I was in. Because it does get frustrating when young people as organizers are told that the work you're doing isn't your work. It's not what you think oh, you're not doing the research, that's just someone else's work. It's real, it's our blood, our sweat, our tears. I remember the night of the budget meeting, and everyone can look this up online if they want to, because all of this is public document. But the budget meeting where we were losing almost $7 million for our education, I broke down and cried because I was just so frustrated at the fact that people were okay with taking things from young people, and that they were okay with showing a gesture that they didn't care about us, even though we were doing the work that we were doing. And I cried, and I talked about how much I was frustrated and the fact that these systems continue to oppress young people, even though we're trying to dismantle them. And from there, adults continued to have faith in me. My organization continued to have faith in the work that I was doing. And the fact that I wanted to become someone who was going to make change in my community. I mean, I'm going to school for a law degree for a reason. Like, I want to make policy, I want to help make change. Might not be a lawyer, might be in the public sector, who knows, but I'm still going to be there. And the things that we learn as organizers and through the things that we're doing, also, they carry beyond just our projects and the movements and the legislations that the pieces of legislation that we pass. And this really hit home with me, like, throughout my first year in college. It was a tough transition being at a predominantly white institution and seeing the really messed up things that I saw on my campus, being told that I was on the wrong side of the wall and that I was gonna get deported, and the fact that black girls on my campus were having rotten bananas put at their doorsteps really shook me as a person. But I remembered the fact that I'm working towards bettering schools, bettering my community, bettering the lives of other young people through the work of BSAC and Youth on Board reminded me that there's still hope and that people still believe that there's change. And people don't doubt me in the work that I'm doing. And that's been a major, major ground stake for me, because without that, I don't think that I would have made it to where I am without BSAC and Youth on Board and the adults that had faith in me and believed in the work that I was doing and the work that I want to do.
That's great, and it may be worth in the Q&A to understand, and there are representatives of those organizations that have supported you.
Jenny, you want to stand up? Yeah. Yes, please, Jenny. Jenny Sazama is the director of Youth on Board. I call Jenny my second mom. I was always at her house. I cried a lot at her house too because I was really frustrated. Punched a lot of pillows because I was frustrated. But Jenny always reminded me that the work that we were doing mattered to someone besides myself, and that it was helping other people. And
so I think it's a really important thing for those of us who are potentially interested in supporting this work to figure out how you also support adults who are supporting this work as well. And let me turn that then to the last question for Lashon and Carlos, which is, there are a number of funders here. Each of you have been in this space for a period of time. What is the one thing, Lashon, that you'd like to encourage funders who are interested in supporting youth in this way to keep in mind? Because it is something that is a bit different, frankly, than lots of other types of funder-related work with different challenges, different opportunities. So,
yeah, I think that first off, when we talk about eliminating poverty, it's going to take all hands on deck. Adults, allies, aunts, uncles, grandmothers, white, black, Asian, you name it. But as far as working with the support of funders, I think that when you ask the question, who here invests in youth organizing, I think a good majority of the room raised their hand. But when you ask the room who's invested in youth power, I can guarantee you that those hands wouldn't, the ratio wouldn't look the same. And the reality, and this is what I've learned through studying nonprofit, is that we're expected to change the world as a 501c3 that has so many limitations that prevent us from doing the real work. And I want to get into it because I'm sure everyone in the room here knows that. But it's going to take innovation, it's going to take taking risks, it's going to take finding those loopholes. You know, when funders want to get money out the door, they find ways to get money out the door. And I think that investing in the power of youth, like I said, it's not just scratching the surface and just, let's say, supporting a program where they, so I don't even want to get into the boast of that, but I know that investing in youth power means putting them in leadership positions, whether it's serving on boards, whether it's creating their own policy recommendations like we've done with Opportunity Youth United, whether it's them working in philanthropy and actually being grant makers instead of grant recipients, if that makes sense. So it's really just like changing the nature of how you relate to young people. Yeah, like I said, put them in a position from grants.
I think that's great. And I think one of the things one takes away is that there are different ways of supporting it. I mean, you can support power. I mean, we do focus that I think many traditional grant makers shy away from some things they can legitimately and legally do and encourage people to look as broadly as they can, but also supporting individual growth is a way of supporting leadership that can lead to power as well. And I hear you saying that there are a broad menu of ways in which you can support both program, organizing and power building along the way. So Carlos, let me end with you before we open it up for everybody else and just ask you, what is your observation for funders in the room about things they should keep in mind as they think about funding youth organizing and the like?
Let's see. So I think youth organizing, the whole field, serves a gazillion purposes. Is that the right number? A gazillion, right? Serves a lot, right?
That's the technical term.
Technical term, right?
Yeah,
so some people are doing supporting young people, particularly in education areas, right? Some people are particularly trying to figure out other issues that people are dealing with, incarceration, deportation, so gazillions of issues, right? So there's tons of stuff. I am particularly concerned because what happens, I think, in youth organizing is that youth organizing begins in this way. Young people and their elders are separated. That's the premises. There's no organization for the both of them, right? That's why there's youth organizing, because there's no cross-generational organizing first. So young people are isolated in a school, in a community. They're going through problems without dialogue, either in the church, either in the school. That's what's going on. Because the young people that are in the churches, they don't consider themselves youth organizers. They're part of that. They're young people in a broader institution, right? So youth organizing emerges from this isolation of young people because we're suffering from high levels of isolation and breaking down of communities all across the country. That's what's going on. So, but the problem is, like, we have 100 million millennials in this country. It's a gazillion. It's a lot of people, right? As my little cousins would say. So I am particularly concerned about what every request, young people start, my school is not working, my community is not working, but then as you work through the problems, as you were saying, you get and you're saying, well, the technical problem is we don't have enough political power or political representation to even change the problems, right? So young people play two games. One, they play the outside game, which is to go protest, do letters to the legislators, they do civil disobedience, all these other things. And when there's enough leverage there, then they play the inside game, which is to be part of the committee, to be part of this decision-making processes, right? And there's like a battle between these two things. Both of them are good, but they're two different things, right? That's what's going on. I think particularly what I am focused on, what I notice in youth organizing, is that, particularly to the question of funders, is that if you look at other countries, right? If you look at Chile, if you look at Brazil, if you look what's going on in Europe, if you look at Africa, if you look at Asia, if you look everywhere, there's major social movements of young people happening, where young people are not just sitting around talking about it. They're also on the streets. In Chile, there was a 6-month strike. I was in Chile about 3 years ago. There was a 6-month strike of all the university systems. There was like chairs buckled on through all the doors in all the major universities across the country for 6 months. There were rallies and demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of people, right? So there's a vibrant movement out there. And then when you come to the US and you think, why is it that we don't have that? Particularly now that Donald Trump is our president. Right now the movements are very quiet, not the same from 5 months ago. Yes or no? Very different. So what happens? So what I notice is that sometimes what happens is that we are made to build organizations, and organizations are more important than the movements. and we put in all this money to support staffing, to support all these other things, and put all these metrics and all this, you gotta do this, you gotta do the other thing. If you don't meet this requirement, and then we make our organizations be highly dependent on the funders. I know I'm losing like 1 million friends here, but that's just the truth. And now that Donald Trump is president, I hope we can tell each other the truth, right? So I think what it's missing sometimes is that a lot of youth organizing, it starts in a local community because of local issues, and sometimes it happens because there's a huge galvanizing force, a social movement, kind of what we saw in Standing Rock, humongous mobilization, right? Thousands of people, exciting, hundreds of tribes coming together, right? We call that in my tradition a moment of the whirlwind. And the immigrant rights movement happened in 2006 with the million marches. I don't know if you all were there too, right? 40 million people marched all over the street, 12% of the population. Galvanized a whole young people when we were walking with our parents in the march to be like, oh my God, there's something we can do because there's no organizations that could hold us, right? So I am very particularly focused about how can you fund the outside game so that we can have more leverage on the inside. I don't know if that makes any sense. How do we fund the outside game so that people on the inside have more leverage? So that where there's $7 million being dropped off, there's not just like demands, but we can actually turn people on the streets and confront the whole city. Because we can, young people in Boston, can shut down the whole city. If I have 1,000 young people, I can shut down 4 or 5 highways, and this city is in shackles. That's just the truth, numerically, right? So how do we fund the outside game? And to me, I'm particularly interested in 3 things, because I think a lot of young people are not particularly interested in going this humongous nonprofit route where we have to meet all these requirements and get stuck there. Again, good people, poor structures. Great people in organizations, but they're tied with the expectations sometimes of the metrics or what we need to do or what place we're in. So to me, there's 3 things that I think we need to fund. Number 1, I think we need to fund convening spaces for people to meet. Here in the state of Massachusetts, we do not have a space, a retreat center for young people to go and have a 4-day retreat. If I want to do that, if I'm a young person, I got to talk to the church. The church cannot do every day because there's Sunday Mass. I got to go to school. There's no freaking space. Well, how do we meet? How do we talk? How do we reflect about our situation if there's no space, right? So we think, at least in Massachusetts, I believe there has to be like a Highlander Center here. We don't have one where people can go and we don't have to pay a lot of money to get in there, because if we have to pay a lot of money and we don't have money, then there's no meeting going to happen. So that's number 1. I think number 2, there's got to be a lot of support to be able to fund what we consider transitional organizing. What does this mean? Is that sometimes a young person wants to organize for 6 months to a year, and most of us do, but in the process we go broke. Does that make sense? Live with your parents, they're paying the rent, you're paying a little bit, you don't know your cell phone, happens 3 months, 6 months, a year, and then you don't have money. And you're like, well, I got to quit or I got to get a job. So how do we fund that moment when you can find 30, 40, 50 young people to come in and out of the organization and expand it quickly without professionalizing the staff too much? I don't know if that makes any sense, right? And the last piece that I would say is that we need to fund more trainings and gatherings for young people to lead. I run a training institute called the Ayni Institute. Ayni means reciprocity from my language in Quechua in Peru. And what we noticed, and why I did a training institute when I was 26, is because most training institutes are run by adults. And when I say adults, people that are over 40 or 50, I was always the youngest in the room. So how do we have training institutes, education programs on community organizing that are run by young people with serious investment, right? So I feel like we need more of that. So those are just some of my reflections just on youth organizing.
That's great. So So I don't know if there are mics or if folks can stand up, just raise your hand. What I'd like to do is just take the first 3 folks and invite them to ask questions or offer comments in terms of the presentations that we've had.
It's so exciting what you all have done.
There's one over here.
It's game changer.
So just if you don't mind introducing yourself.
I can.
Hi, Doug.
Douglas Wood, the Ford Foundation. What an amazing panel. Thank you so much for all of your insight. Carlos, I want to just double down a little bit, get a little bit more of what you were saying about the outside-inside piece. Can you say a little bit more about how funders can help with the inside part of that? I know that what you were saying is that we should invest on the outside part and it affects the inside. But can you say a little bit more about the inside in terms of infrastructure?
Let's take 3 questions because I think unfortunately we have limited time. We'll take the 3 questions and then have final comments from our panel. There was a couple other hands up.
Hi, I'm Amber. I'm from the Center for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute. Carlos, I think you had a really great wish list for funders. I'm wondering if there are other things on your wish list that you would like funders to be paying more attention to that were not on Carlos's list.
Great. And the third hand, I saw a couple of others. We'll go with those 2 unless Steve, did you want? Go ahead, Steve.
Would you guys respond to what you're seeing with your peers right now in this moment we're in the country? So increase in arrests right now for undocumented folks, big shift in justice policy right now in real time with Sessions. Just if you guys are hearing or feeling that on the ground, it would be helpful to hear reactions from the community.
Great. So I'm going to just ask you, we only have limited time, so in a minute or so, just let's go down the road, pick whichever of the questions you want to answer. What advice in terms of the inside game that funders might want to keep in mind, other recommendations for funders, and then just personally, I mean, we're at a time, real pain in our country, and especially for young people, undocumented people sleeping in the street because they're afraid to go home, criminal justice reform, which has been a source of some promise being reversed, a federal government that seems to have given up on many of the fundamental things we care about in terms of justice and humanity. Lashon, answer. Give us hope. Give us inspiration.
Easy question.
I'll speak to Doug's question. I think for the inside game, I think that similar to what he mentioned, there's not too many spaces where young people can, 1, engage in dialogue, and 2, be engaged in dialogue that's designed towards solution. Too often young people engage as far as what are the issues, but not too often are they engaged in conversations about what are the solutions, and then taking those solutions and putting them in front of the leaders that need to see what they have to offer. Outside of that,
that's great. Let's keep on coming on down.
I think one thing on our wish list as youth organizers would be investment in our training sessions that we give to other people. We'd like to give our information and our radical thinking and our organizing out to other people so that they can continue to blossom and grow these ideas across the nation. And with that, things can go even further than they're going right now. Like, we are only one little seed, and imagine just dispersing us across the nation. You'd have flowers and flowers of youth organizers.
Great.
Yeah, sorry, my mind kind of went blank. I'm kind of nervous, but yeah, it truly is kind of a painful time to be an American right now of any ethnicity, and you know, I feel like that was clearly represented with what happened in Standing Rock. I was personally arrested out of a ceremony, and you know, went to jail in my underwear, and you know, I got charged with a felony and 2 misdemeanors for being, you know, in a sweat lodge on the frontline camp directly in the path of the pipeline. That sucked. I still have the charges I got to go to court for. And, you know, when it comes to funding, like he said, you know, funding more trainings or spaces for youth to come together across the nation, because we can't do this alone. We eventually need to unite nationwide and globally if that's possible in our lifetime. But yeah, you know, like funding the trainings, the spaces for us to convene, you know, that's where it's at.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, it's key. The trap that we have is that we cannot fund political campaigns. But most of what we need is political campaigns. We need to remove people out of office. We need to have political leverage. That's the basic things that we need to succeed so that young people are not getting killed in the street or deported and we have a future. That's the basic premises. So how do we fund that? There's like a million constraints. I cannot ask you to give me your foundations all your money to run a political campaign and then you lose all your statuses, right? So to me, I think it's important that we fund the ecosystem of what might create the mobilization. So, and particularly to me, I think most of the money, I would say 90% of the money goes into the inside game, goes into us doing lobbying, goes into us meeting with legislators, writing reports. That is important. I'm not saying it's not. But what creates the real leverage is when people stand in rock, go and do mass mobilization. That is what creates the leverage. When young people go, undocumented dreamers go, and do mass demonstration on the streets, target the president, protest him at every meeting, that is what creates the leverage for us to change the inside conversation, but there's a disparity of the funding. So I'm excited to talk to funders if they want to talk about that, not for me, but for the ecosystem, because it's not about one group. We need it for everybody to run.
I think it's great. I think it's a challenge. I mean, I suspect there'll be different people who have different views on exactly how we can support this kind of work, and also what role youth organizing plays. I mean, what you all have described is deeply inspirational. It's also, frankly, others who are combining with it that make it ultimately realize its full potential. And what you've done, I think, is offer not just something that's inspirational and powerful, but put the right questions on the table for foundations to think about as they're committed to doing what they can in the ways that they can make change. I mean, I'm really struck by, your recommendations about building out infrastructure, about building training, about providing space for conversations to take place. These are things that foundations can and should take up, and I think the way in which you've explained what you do, the vision that you bring, the inspiration that you provide, as well as the talent that you contribute, are really important jumping off points. So I'd ask everybody to join me in really thanking our panel for kicking this off in a very powerful way. Nice job. Thank you. This was great.
Hello. Hi. I'm Sherry Brady. Hi. Welcome. Thank you for coming. And thank you again for the panel. Let's just give them a round of applause. This was great. So I'm just going to give you a really quick, just as there were some challenges that the young people here talked about in sort of questioning what philanthropy could do to make this movement flourish and continue. You have a chance to discuss that with each other at the table conversations after the break. But as we get to that, we asked for some folks in the field to give us some response to the panel. So I'm actually going to call them to the stage. We have Aria Summers-Landsberger from GSER. We have Luna Yasui from the Ford Foundation, who are going to come up and give us response. And then we have Eric Braxton, who's also going to give us his response. He's from the Funders Committee on Youth Organizing. Yes, nailed it. And he's going to not just talk about his responses, but really give us some history on sort of the youth organizing movement and youth organizing field where it stands now. And then that will help lead us into a small table conversations where we have a series of questions we want you to talk to among your peers. There'll be a note taker who can help us get those themes, and so that we can talk about next steps and what that'll be like after this after this meeting, and sort of next steps for the field and for us as the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Aspen and Hyams for this opportunity. And I have to say, I feel extremely humbled and honored to follow such an incredible panel of young people. I'm really inspired, and I don't think that I could say anything better than the words that they had themselves. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about our perspective and how we have seen young people inspire the work at GSER and what we've seen, sort of the ripple effects in our philanthropic community. And I think Carlos mentioned this, but I'm going to elaborate a little bit because I think it's important to highlight one part of this story, which is the Dreamer movement. So in the mid-2000s, Dreamers, young people, came to lawyers. I used to be one of these lawyers, and they told us, we want to organize, we want to engage in civil disobedience, we want to do things differently. And lawyers said, that's a little risky. We wouldn't advise you to do that. It might get you into trouble. That's not really the right path. This is the way we do legislation, and this is the way we do action. And the lawyers were wrong. What was proven is that the Dreamers and young people themselves really knew how to drive a movement and to drive change. And I think that has really impacted the immigrant rights community. And within GSER, and with the support of OSF, Ford, and the New York Community Trust, in 2012, when DACA was finally announced, which was a huge victory, philanthropy got together and they said, how are we going to ensure young people can now access this form of protection that they fought for? And so the Delivering on the Dream collaboratives were formed. There were 3 of them. These were funder collaboratives across a few states to help drive applications for young people to get access to this form of protection. Today, there are 18 funder collaboratives in 15 states. They've raised over $25 million, engaged 103 state and local funders, 40% of which are completely new to grant making in this space. And these collaboratives across the country have completed 10,000 DACA applications plus 13,000 other forms of relief that young people were eligible for that they didn't know they were eligible for. And thank you. And I share that story because it started with young people. They drove that movement. And I think it was a space where philanthropy really had an opportunity and came together. And now we're in a new moment. So now we have these successes that we've built on. A lot of those collaboratives invested in legal services, know your rights information. And what we see right now is young people, once again, are at the forefront. They're in their communities delivering know your rights information. They're helping the rest of their families understand what could happen to them in a detention and enforcement context. And they're building relationships and alliances with other sectors. They're working at the cross-section of criminal justice, juvenile justice, immigrant rights, child advocacy. And so when we ask ourselves, where do we start now? How do we respond now? What do we build from? It's there. It's with young people. And I think it's really upon us to ensure that we're bringing young people's voices authentically into our spaces. And one thing that we've learned for sure is to be very careful about gatekeeper organizations who, who may be working on these various issues, but they're not inclusive of young people. It's that outside-inside dynamic. And I think to be really mindful in our analysis, if we're doing a landscape analysis before we do our grant making, to really think about where are the young people, where are the movement builders? And I think if we really push ourselves in that direction, we're going to be helping to support movements that are going to drive change in the next generation and help protect the few rights that we've been able to keep in our immigrant and refugee communities. So those are just a few words. I really don't want to take too much more time because I have a wonderful colleague who's going to follow me with some very insightful thoughts as well. And I welcome any questions during our small group time around how the collaboratives worked and how we're working now to reevaluate what are we going to do next to ensure that we're inclusive of young people in our work and in our changing of the current policy climate. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. That was awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And thank you first and foremost to Ken and our panelists for really just an inspiring session. And it kind of confirms to me, Ari and I were joking earlier, why do we need to be here? Because really this conversation isn't about us, but about these leaders and organizers. Although I will say that if you are not a GSER member, definitely consider it, great resource. So my name is Lunesi. I'm with the Ford Foundation's Youth Opportunity and Learning team. And I think I'm just going to share a little bit of my journey into this youth organizing and leadership space, because I think it actually tracks a little bit of this conversation here. I've had the good fortune, both with at the Ford Foundation and also at Open Society Foundations, to work on a number of social justice issues, including immigrant rights, low-wage worker rights, gender justice, LGBT rights, and criminalization. And and if you'll note, what's missing there is actually, youth organizing. And so when Ford has gone through a series of transitions, and we started a conversation about whether, what role I could play in thinking about Ford's youth leadership and next generation leadership space. And I was like, what? I don't know anything about young people. Like, you're talking to the wrong person. And then we saw this explosion of we have been seeing an explosion of mass participation and transformative organizing, right? And this, I'm talking before kind of Indivisible and, this, like the last 5 months, but really looking at Dreamers, the Movement for Black Lives, Standing Rock, and realizing, oh wait, these are all, of course, young people, and then got to really thinking about how, as a foundation, each of us have actually come at these issues sideways, and it got me to thinking, what does it mean for a foundation committed to addressing inequality to actually not have a head-on way to look at next generation leadership? And so much of what people have shared today resonates because it really, that inquiry, and it is an evolving one, right, is central to our work. The other thing I do want to note is that when Arya were invited to do this, I reached back out and said, thank you so much for the opportunity. Is this going to be like, it's like a low-key thing, right? Yeah, 20 people, it'll be totally chill. Like, you just have to respond to the panel. I walk in, it's like, there's like 200 people in here. And it's also, I'm a lawyer by training, so I like to be able to preview, say I'm going to have 3 points. But as these, there's so much juiciness coming from the panel that like I can't even, there's too many things. But I will try to, I'm gonna share sort of, I do wanna reflect on 2 common threads that I think came through that, again, deeply inform Ford's work. One is I was really struck by, yet again, the affirmation that the solutions to the most entrenched problems in our lifetime come from those most deeply impacted by people who are actually experiencing these injustices. 2, that to state the obvious in this room, that they are young people. And 3, that I think what we've seen in a number of these movements is this idea of work and organizations and movements that really, that allow people to bring their whole selves into the work, right? That part of the challenge that we've had as institutional philanthropy is we organize ourselves in silos, so when things like the undocumented queers come up, or when we're unable to sort of process that information, right? And so really thinking, it's been also a lesson for as a funder to really actually try to see the work for what it is rather than try to squeeze it into its boxes. So that's one thing that informs our work. The other that struck me, or that is, I think I've heard a number of times in this room and beyond the notion that young people are at the forefront of social justice. They're the ones bending the arc and all this, right? And that is absolutely true. I think that there's a corollary to that, which is that movements and democratic participation and activism are transformative for young people. And I know Eric is going to speak to that a little bit too. But it's like, and that matters, that the experiences that a young person has, how they experience their engagement in democracy, and I mean not just formal democracy, but the act of speaking out and protest also, actually has impact for generations to come. Right? And so we need to think about how do we at Ford think not just about supporting the activist networks that are out there, which is absolutely what we do. It's one prong of our work. We call it invest. We invest in social justice organizing led by and for young people. But we also really are deeply concerned with this issue of how we connect that work to the discipline of actually building out, how do we connect that to durable activism, to a lifetime of social justice engagement and leadership. And that's in some ways, it's an entirely different question because it's a different approach. It requires an investment by a multitude of stakeholders, and really thinking long and hard about training infrastructure, as Carlos and others have spoken about in this country, which on the progressive side is something that we lack. Those are the 2 things. The last piece, though, that I want to acknowledge and really sit with Carlos and others around is this idea as a funder of what is the proper role of institutional philanthropy in supporting movements. I think the first rule that I carry into philanthropy is to do no harm. But it is movement funding is a space where donors can really, really just distort all kinds of things, and I think it is a challenge for donors. I also think it's I feel like we hold attention in that context, right? On one hand, organizations absolutely matter. The soccer team matters. You have to have a vehicle for people, a place for people to meet, a place for people to, organizational sort of coming together. On the other hand, you can't actually sort of precondition all that as a donor, because that is just, it's like the opposite of what you want to be doing. And so I think one of the things that, in terms of how that conversation has been reflected and digested forward, is we are leaning very heavily towards a grant-making approach that is largely general operating support, and that also really focuses on the organizational strengthening components. And that is a little bit of a different way of funding, right? It is an ecosystem approach. It's saying maybe the best we can do is actually create the conditions for incredible change to happen. And it's a little bit of a scary proposition for, I think, donors who have to account for certain things. But it's been very helpful for us in being in authentic conversation with leaders. So I'll just leave it at that. And I'm delighted to wait, who is someone introducing Eric, or you just, oh, did it, done. All right, he needs no introduction.
Thank you, Luna. I do feel fully introduced. I do have talking points here, because without them I might just end up talking about the Cavs game or something like that for a long time. I'm from Philly. All right, So just to introduce myself again, my name is Eric Braxton. I'm the Executive Director of the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing. And FCYO is an organization that was founded in 2000 by a group of funders that wanted to increase philanthropic investment in youth-led social change. We believe that engaging low-income young people and young people of color is critical to addressing poverty, racism, and other pressing social issues. Our mission is to help build a strong and stable youth organizing field that allows young people to be at the forefront of social change. And so we do this through 5 main strategies. That's regranting, infrastructure development, capacity building, funder advocacy, advisory and learning, and research and communications. But before coming to the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing, I was also a youth organizer. When I was 19, I helped form an organization called the Philadelphia Student Union that organized high school students around educational justice in Philly and is still around today. So what I wanted to do with this time is take a little bit of time to share about what we at FCYO mean by youth organizing, what's the current state of the field, and what are some of the trends and outcomes that we're seeing. So as many people have said, whoops, is this not? There we go, I have to point this the right direction, that's the trick. All right, so as many people have said, youth organizing is not new. Whether it's the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the labor movement, young people have always been at the forefront of social justice movements in this country. And that's because young people have an inherent sense of justice and a willingness to take risks and stand up for what they believe in. But there was something new that happened in this country in the 1990s, where a new set of youth organizing groups spread across the country. And we think there were mainly 3 influences that were particularly important about this. First, the 1990s saw the rise of the idea of young people of color as super predators, followed by an increase in public policies that specifically attacked and criminalized young people of color. And young people began organizing in response to those attacks. Second, in the 90s, you had the rise of positive youth development and a set of youth workers who realized that not only did young people have skills and assets that could be developed, but that they also had the power to address real structural issues in their communities. And then third, these groups were influenced by a number of different community organizing traditions, including Alinsky organizing, groups coming out of the civil rights like SNCC. So through all of that, there was a new set of youth organizing groups born in the 1990s that combined youth organizing and youth development and organized young people around some specific attacks that young people were experiencing at that time. So at FCYO, when we talk about youth organizing, there are a couple of characteristics that we think are really essential. First, that youth organizing reaches the most marginalized young people, that solutions have to come by those who are most directly impacted. Second, these groups are not just protest organizations. They offer intentional leadership development and a range of supports that support young people's leadership and holistic development. Third, youth organizing groups have core leaders, but they also have a base and a membership that they're accountable to. If there's no base and there's no membership, it's not organizing. Fourth, youth organizing groups organize campaigns that address inequality, change policies, and improve people's lives. And fifth, youth organizing creates a leadership pipeline that supports a sustainable pool of leaders for the social justice movement. So what's the state of the current youth organizing field? So one of the new toys that we have at the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing is this interactive online map and database of youth organizing groups. And if you go to our website, you can sign up for a profile. And you can go on there and you can search and you can find out who's organizing around immigration in Texas. So we just created this a few months ago, so the data is still coming in. It's a little bit new, but even in the first couple of months, we now have about 150 organizations that have completed profiles on there. Another 200 organizations are still generating them, so there'll be a lot more data in the coming months. But so we recognized currently about 151 organizations in 31 states. You can see that there's a lot in California and New York, but there's 15 or so in the South and a good spread across the country. In terms of organizing models, so we talked a lot about the role of youth and adult partnerships. So about a third of the groups that we support are standalone youth-led organizations. A third are intergenerational organizations where young people and adults are organizing together. And another third are youth-led projects within adult organizations. Increasingly, we'll talk about this more, young people and adults are partnering. 20 years ago when I started doing this work, there was much more talk about we were building a youth movement. Now there's much more focus that we are building strong youth leadership in broad social justice movements. In terms of budget distribution, about a third of these organizations have budgets under $250,000. Another third have budgets between $250,000 and $750,000, and then there's about a third that are over $750,000 up to $1 million. Most of those are part of larger organizations, but just to give you a sense of who are these organizations that we're talking about. We're still sort of coding the data from the map on the issues that young people are working on, but I can tell you that the big three issues continue to be education, immigration, and criminal justice. And in terms of the young people that are part of these organizations, so 96% of the groups that we hear from work with young people 13 to 18. Another 58% were working with 18 to 21-year-olds, and the vast majority are working with low-income young people and young people of color. So, as I said, I've been involved in youth organizing for a number of years, and I want to talk about some of the ways that the field has changed over those years. First off, that there is a field, right? When I started in youth organizing, we were making everything up. We felt like we were the only ones doing this. We had to kind of reinvent the wheel. And now there actually are conferences, intermediaries, training institutes. There's a lot of opportunities for new organizations to learn from those who figured some things out over the last couple of years. So there is a field. But I want to highlight two main areas of growth over the last few years. First is the increased power and scale of victories. And the second is the increased ability to support the holistic development of youth leaders. So on the increased power of victories, So again, when I started in youth organizing, we were really happy to win small victories like cleaning bathrooms and getting textbooks for students, and those small victories still play really important roles. But we need to acknowledge that now young people are winning huge victories that fundamentally transform their communities and benefit hundreds of thousands of people. So one example of this is school discipline, where youth organizing groups have fundamentally changed the terrain and the common sense of what we believe makes sense in school discipline. A few years ago, the trend was all about harsher discipline and zero tolerance. But young people started organizing and raising these issues, and now dozens of districts across the country have passed new codes of conduct that promote restorative practices and that address disparities in discipline for students of color. So the common sense on that issue has fundamentally been changed by youth organizing. Another major issue that young people have transformed is around immigration. And we heard from Carlos earlier the way that undocumented young people began telling their stories, began organizing campaigns, got the president to pass deferred action, pushed in-state tuition. Another example that I want to give is around college prep for all. In California, a number of youth organizing groups have got their districts to pass policies that ensure that all students have access to college preparatory curriculum. In Los Angeles, when Inner City Struggle got their district to pass this bill in 2005, the school board president said that this was the most significant school reform that had happened in LA in 25 years. Now, this slide to me says something that's very important about the impact and power of youth organizing. So in 2005, Inner City Struggle got the LA School Board to pass that policy. At that point, only 44% of students in East LA were graduating from high school, and that was without college preparatory curriculum. Today, after they got that policy passed in 2005, they've spent the last 12 years organizing to make sure that it's implemented, and now they can say that 83% of students in East LA are graduating with college preparatory curriculum. That's a victory won by youth organizing that's benefiting hundreds of thousands of young people who are getting access to college. So these are the kinds of victories that youth organizing groups are now able to win. Another interesting trend is that more youth organizing groups have started incorporating nonpartisan voter engagement into their organizing work. Our data shows that 40% of youth organizing groups do voter registration and get out the vote, and several groups have developed quite sophisticated voter engagement programs. They knock on the doors of tens of thousands of folks, and they're also using new technology in order to reach millennial voters. Everybody, political parties, everybody is struggling to figure out how do we reach millennial voters. The folks who know how to do it are these youth organizing groups. So another big way that youth organizing has grown is in its ability to support the holistic needs of youth leaders. When I started out in youth organizing, many of us would say, we don't do services. We're radical, we're organizers. But now more and more youth organizers have realized that the young people that they work with are suffering from the same systems of inequity as the other young people in their communities, and if they're going to help young people become lifelong community leaders, they also have to support their holistic development. So more and more groups over the last few years have become incorporating intentional academic, social and emotional, and social service referrals into their work. The data that we have collected at FCYO says that more groups are making these in-house intentional programs, not just doing it in ad hoc ways. And the research is showing that because of that, that youth organizing groups are now some of the most effective groups at achieving youth development and social and emotional learning outcomes, especially for the most marginalized young people. So bear with me while I nerd out for a minute and talk about some of the outcomes that we're seeing from youth organizing groups. So one of the first quantitative studies on youth organizing outcomes for individuals was published in our occasional paper series, Building Transformative Youth Leadership, in 2011. And one of its findings was that young people in youth organizing groups have significant opportunities for meaningful leadership. They facilitate meetings, they develop strategy, they conduct outreach, and this is significant because we know that young people of color want to be civically engaged, but often don't have the same opportunities as their white and more affluent peers. But youth organizing gives them those opportunities in uniquely supportive environments. Another main finding of that research was that involvement in youth organizing helps young people feel a sense of agency in their lives, the belief that they have control over their actions and can make a difference in the world around them. And this is so critical for marginalized young people who often feel a lack of control over their own lives. But not only does youth organizing help build individual agency, but it also builds a sense of collective agency, the sense that together young people and their communities can come together and make changes. In a society that often marginalizes the experiences and voices of youth of color and renders them powerless, young people's discovery of their own power helps to shift their sense of self, expectations of their future, and their sense of the possible roles they might play in the world. This study also showed that young people in youth organizing groups said that it helped them improve their grades, but more importantly, that it increased their educational motivation, with 75% of them wanting to achieve a 4-year degree or higher, compared to only 25% for Black and Latino young people nationally. More recently now, Dr. Veronica Tariquez at the University of Southern California has followed more than 1,000 young people in youth programs funded by the California Endowment, and they've been able to compare the outcomes for youth organizing groups and youth development and youth leadership groups. The youth organizing groups actually outperformed many youth development groups on most of the indicators, with the exceptions being grades and health. The newest research that we have is from a study by Rod Watts and Ben Kirshner on youth organizing groups in the United States, Northern Ireland, and South Africa. And this is going to be featured in FCYO's new upcoming briefing document, but I'll give you a sneak peek of some of the key findings. The first finding is that youth organizing, one of the reasons that youth organizing speaks to low-income young people and young people of color is that it creates a uniquely supportive environment. They create a safe, inviting spaces that speak to the lived cultural and political experiences of young people of color. They also found that young people who feel supported and affirmed in their organizations do better on all of the other outcomes they were measuring. This study also found that youth organizing groups were extremely effective at meeting the social and emotional learning outcomes that many researchers have realized are really essential to outcomes for young people. And that in addition to the traditional social and emotional learning outcomes, that youth organizing has additional benefits around critical thinking and root cause analysis that more traditional programs don't address. Finally, there's also now longitudinal research that shows that young people who are involved in youth organizing years after, that there are sustained benefits. This study from California showed that young people involved in youth organizing were more likely than similar peers to attend 4-year universities and were more likely to remain civically engaged years after. Sorry, I gotta make sure this catches up. Sorry about that. So in closing, part of what we believe is so powerful about youth organizing is the multiple levels of impact. As funders, you often have to choose between approaches that address the needs of individuals or systemic and policy solutions. So we see youth organizing as a 2-for-1 investment in that it powerfully achieves individual and systematic impacts that fuel each other. And I want to finally just talk about the moment that we're in right now. About 3 or 4 years ago, there was a major decrease in funding for youth organizing. A few groups closed, several others had to reduce staff. In the last 2 years, things have started to change, and I think that's really attributable to the work of young people of color on the school-to-prison pipeline, the undocumented student movement, the movement for Black Lives, and the Dakota Access Pipeline, that they have demonstrated the power of young people of color. And while things have improved a lot in the last couple of years, there are still some big gaps. Newer groups and those in areas with less philanthropic resource are still really struggling. And as Carlos talked about earlier, we need to both fund organizations, and we also need to fund the collective tissue and the movement in infrastructure that helps those organizations come together to form powerful movements. The question right now is, will this renewed interest from philanthropy and youth organizing be another short-term trend, or can we actually shift the paradigm from seeing young people as deficits to having the power to change their communities? So our world is facing some significant environmental, economic, and political challenges. The best way to address these challenges is to build a strong pipeline of leaders from the communities most impacted by inequity. Over the last few years, we've seen young people shown that they are ready to take this kind of leadership. It's now the role of adults to see if we can create the opportunity structure that makes that possible. And finally, I just want to say a brief commercial. For those that are interested in digging in deeper on these issues, FCYO is organizing a funder briefing in Los Angeles with the California Endowment on August 1st and 2nd. And I think there's more details about that at your table. But if other folks are interested in digging deeper on these issues, we'd love to see many of you there. So thanks a lot. I'm really glad to have this conversation, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have had a lot of information, heard a lot of things to think about, and so we're going to get a chance to discuss the small table, then do some debrief and think about sort of what this means for the field and what this means as we move forward. Give you a 10-minute break. So be back here at, I guess, 4:40, and to be ready to engage in conversation at your tables. We'll have some questions for you to think about as a response. Like I said, there'll be someone there to capture the high level that comes out from it. And there's some snacks outside, and the restrooms are also outside. Thank you. I hope there were great conversations. It sounded like as I was walking through and trying to put out some of my own fires at this table. So I'd love to just take a couple minutes to do some pop-ups and hear your themes and high-level things that you would like to share. And the note takers, please make sure you share the notes with me, but we'll get them, and we were gonna do it on a flip chart, but Christina's just gonna take notes there in the back of the room. So, volunteer, be voluntold? Just one key insight.
One take home.
No insights, no nothing.
The benefits to youth of being involved in youth organizing. I thought that was really impressive, that study or piece of information. It's so it's inspiring to help us move forward to be able to help these groups with what they need.
And I should say, we'll make Eric's slides available. He will ship them to me, and I will make sure that there's a link to at least a Dropbox to you.
Thanks, Sherry. We had a very nice conversation. One highlight for me was this idea of the ecosystem. That metaphor kept coming up, and we took it even more, how to make sure that our funding is unlocking things that can be a catalyst and not a container, sort of just really resourcing the movement.
Thank you, Sherry. At our table, we really talked about the need to bring together the various opportunities to continue to develop the pipeline of youth leadership. So we have wonderful youth like Savina, who continues to be supported by BSAC. But how do we not lose those young people? How do we create a robust pipeline that allows you to stay in the movement, whether that's through the public sector or the private sector?
Thank you. Others?
So over here at this table, there were tons of great points, but there are two key ones that popped up, and one was the topic of the idea of not professionalizing the organizing, and so we spoke about the idea that we can incorporate those organizing techniques and strategies into every and all professional aspects and fields. And so it's a factor of working what Carlos called the outside and inside game. It's making sure that those are in tandem and in lockstep. So making sure that if someone's a biologist, they have those organizing techniques and mindset that they can apply to the work that they're doing. We also spoke about, in terms of funding, and how difficult it is to organize when you have short-term goals that you have to reach, and how difficult that is to impact long-term change. And we talked about the idea of setting a long-term goal, so setting a 10-year, 20-year goal, but also planning with short-term checkpoints in mind so that you can communicate and have that balanced and level conversation with your funders. So those are two of the key points that we had in our discussion.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Sorry, I'm a little shy. I'm actually the youth that you guys are funding, so I'm coming from... because I'm on the other side, I realize how hard it is for you guys to go through proposals and things, because I want you guys to fund this, but I know there's other people out there that also need the help. So I want to thank you guys for all the hard work you guys do for me, and I'm just waiting to achieve and be an opportunity youth.
Great. Anyone else?
At our table, there were two themes that came up that were a little bit in conflict. They weren't resolved, but one was, I think it resonated with all of us, Carlos's notion of moving away from just the organizational frame and thinking about building the movement and how to fund the movement. There's some great examples of alternate ways to fund movement and movement builders, but then at the same time, there's also acknowledgement that organizations don't have the funding to grow and sustain themselves. So there's also this conflict, if you're moving away from organization funding and organization building to movement building, how are you going to really make sure that you sustain the best organizations, help them grow, nurture them? I don't know if we resolved that, but it was an interesting dilemma.
Anything else? Great. Well, thank you. Oh, wait, got one more. Sorry.
Maybe just to take that one step further, I think the question was, how does this conversation inform our thinking with the Opportunity Youth space?
Great. So we're in the home stretch, guys, I swear. So thank you very much for the conversation and for sharing those high points with us and helping us as we think about next steps and moving the field forward in this. So I'd like to invite David Barth from the Ford Foundation to the stage to give us some reflections.
Thank you, Sherry. Wow, this has been some afternoon. I owe a real debt of gratitude to the organizers. This is something special. I was invited up to issue a call to action, and I'm a little bit humbled by it because, well, I was talking to Thaddeus before we started, and he was pointing out that there are people in this room who've been working this issue for 20 years. And for 20 years, would not have been able to assemble 15 people. And now we're looking at hundreds of people who are seized by the work, understand the importance. And so that we owe a great debt of gratitude to those who came before us. So let me just say I'm up here, but you guys are the ones who've really called us to action. I think Steve asked me to do this because he thought I'd come up here with the zeal of the newly converted, that I'd come up here with some real fire about this. I come from the Ford Foundation, And the Ford Foundation has been investing in social justice movements since before the Johnson administration. Civil rights and voting rights and indigenous people's rights all around the world and fighting apartheid. We didn't call it youth-led social justice movements, but that's what it was in every case. And I think what's new for us is we're being intentional about this. We are calling out a commitment to youth-led social justice movements, mostly because we've decided to rethink our philanthropy around notions that we should be combating drivers of inequality. And drivers of inequality manifest themselves in the life course of young people in the most extreme fashions. So for us, it became, as we looked at it from that perspective, self-evident that investments in young people and in their own autonomy and in their own agency and in their own ability to influence community and participate was both the moral and ethical thing, but also the most effective way to ensure our ability to transform over generations. So that's how I find myself up here. And I think it's important to think about moments in time. And clearly, as a society, we're at a moment in time. Issues that we thought were well established and safe are now under threat, and that was quite sudden. Principles that we valued, structures that we had in place that we didn't think were vulnerable now seem vulnerable. But there's also a renewal of energy and passion, particularly among young people, which make it a significant moment in time. I actually think that this is the time where we're best positioned to restore a certain faith in democracy. If we really believe it, this is the time for us to prove it. So we can look at that moment in time. The other way to look at moment is the moment in a young person's life. That as they transition through adolescence, this is the time that they'll be able to set a course for how they will participate, how they will be citizens for the rest of their lives. And so the investment becomes really crucial, that we step in and say, now is the time for you to understand your own power, for you to understand community and altruism and compassion and empathy and participation, and understand power and the complicated dynamics of power. Eric's data was really powerful. Investing in youth leadership, youth organizing, has a multiplying effect across the course of the life of the young person, but it's also that 2-for-1. So from a funder's perspective, it becomes almost self-evident. We're hoping to see transformative change on social issues, and we know that we get that through active leadership. And we're also going to see generational change in young people if we invest in them early enough and with intention in a way that is driven by their own expression of what it is they need. So we think that there's a pretty powerful leverage that comes out of investing in young people. So to the funders in the room, in conversations with my peers, I think there's sometimes anxiety about investing in this kind of in youth organizing or youth leadership, and it's because it seems like it's really hard, and it's not easy, but it's not nearly as hard as it used to be. I think for those who were here 20 years ago, I think they'd support the argument. Look, youth organizations can be transitional, right? You can't always wrap your hands around them. They can be self-assembling quite quick, and they can dissolve quite quickly. They also are part of constellations. There's no, you want to send a check to the Movement for Black Lives, there's no address, right? You're talking about a constellation of actors, which when you're a funder, complicates your ability to have relationships. And if you're a good funder, you want to be in relationships with grantees that are constructive for everyone. But we're in a period now where very talented intermediaries have emerged, which make our lives much easier. There are centers that do training, that do outreach, that encourage participation, which have fixed addresses, which make our work easier, and networks are evolving. And those networks have homes and are places where you can develop enduring relationships to help make sure that your funds are going where they need to go. So the scaffolding is there, and that's really important. That's what makes now a moment different than where we once were. The other thing that comes up a lot when I talk to funders is risk. There's a bunch of different kinds of risk. The first and most urgent risk that we worry about is we're encouraging young people themselves to put themselves in vulnerable positions. And that keeps us up at night. When we fund an activist in Cairo, we know that she may be putting herself in danger. And so that's a kind of risk that we wrestle with. There are those who then are, on the flip side, are concerned with the reputational risk to their own organizations. And what we say to them is, if you care about social change, you need people to be bold, and young people will be bold, and they will make mistakes. So you do have to have a certain tolerance for the fact that we're going to encourage young people to lead and to learn from mistakes and to grow stronger in the process. The other risk that you hear a little bit is about return on investment. And that to me comes out of a certain fetishization about metrics that we've probably, that shows a lack of patience. The social transformation, the large systemic transformation, is not an immediate, it's not a vaccination. And I think we need to be really conscious of that. When you listen to what Khalees and Trenton and Lashon and Carlos were saying earlier, if you were listening, you heard them describe problems that were by their nature intersectional, and then engage a bunch of different systems. If you talk about education, you're also talking about the encroachment of criminal justice. If you're talking about a natural resource issue, you're also talking about public health. And so the return on your investment is something that we can look backwards at and say, well, every social justice movement that has these intersectional qualities to it has effectuated change over time. But from a so you need to develop a certain comfort with that level of risk. And if that's hard, then there are other ways to participate in the community of practice, right? And I think it needs to be very much reflective of your foundation and your organization and your ability to do that. But I think we can say with a great deal of confidence that we think we'll be able to see the outcome of this hypothesis play out year after year. We've seen it in the past. We just haven't always called it out. So we're excited. Another thing I was thinking about, and that's something we think about a lot, is whether developing a culture of protest will create cynicism about democratic systems. I think you heard it today, and we certainly feel like we've seen it. Investing in leadership and participation will help restore faith that a system can be responsive. We want young people to participate in the institutions of power, because that's how we disrupt power. I think Lashon called it infiltrate power, which I'm going to steal. That's going to be the source of authentic solutions, right? When we can infiltrate that power. I think it's not my place to issue a call to action. I just feel like I can say from our perspective, we have committed ourselves to this in the long term. This is going to be the lion's share of what we invest in our portfolio. And that includes what I hope is going to be a multi-year commitment to these guys. We've got some conversations we've got to have. Because we're confident that this is the key to significant change in the social sectors and in our ability to deliver real equity. Okay. The other thing we'll commit to is being a thought partner to all of you. We've been doing, I was going to say a year, but Luna, what's it, like 3 years of real serious thought around this, strategizing, tactics, et cetera. And so we are, as a foundation, available to you just so you don't have to, go through the same torture we did. Let me extend that. And I would say this, for those of you who may not want to intentionally and deliberately invest in the way we're talking about, I hope you'll come out of here encouraged to be a member of a community of practice. To at least say, as you're focusing on a collective impact program or a community development program, there'll be a trigger there that says, this is a place where we could use some authentic youth voice and continue to participate in these exchanges over how we can strengthen each other's work by doing that. And at a minimum, I would encourage you to get to know GSER, get to know the Funders Collaborative for Youth Organizing. Join. It's not a major investment, and you will find yourself significantly enriched in your work as we have. So again, let me thank the organizers. Can't wait for tomorrow. The rest, this has been spectacular. This is quite a grand scene. I think it brings a certain seriousness and legitimacy to this whole thing. It's really the culmination of a huge amount of work. So let me, Sherry especially, I can see her down there. So thank you all, and thank you to everyone who had the courage and enthusiasm to share their stories today. I think we all will walk away with that as the takeaway. And so I encourage you all to, at a minimum, keep the conversation going and to reach out to each other, because together is how we're going to get there. So thank you.
So I'm going to call Monique Miles, who's going to be leading us for the rest of the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund convening, who's our fearless leader as we move forward. This is just my tiny, tiny little piece of it. She's the Grand Master, so thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Sherry. I'm excited to go after David because there's so much alignment and connection with his closing remarks and the call to action I'm going to share on behalf of the Aspen Forum team. And I love that you finished talking about stories, because that's actually where I wanted to begin with this closing. So it felt like such an incredible honor to be here today, to be in the room, in part because our work with the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund is growing and expanding. And when we think about these 23 communities that we're supporting, this network of cross-system sector partners that are working in these communities across the country to improve education and workforce outcomes for Opportunity Youth, the comments today really in my heart took me back to thinking about stories in the context of social movements. And I heard Carlos talk about this. I heard Trenton and Savina and Lashon talk about this. And to be fair, I absolutely heard them say strategy is critical, right? Carlos talked, we were reminded that he talked about both inside and outside organizing. We also heard systems and structures are so critical to how we do long-term and sustainable change. But my takeaway was actually thinking about what happens in the center of the story, the center of the narrative. I thought there was this beautiful thread that was weaved around the clarity that really begins to inform the strategy when we heard Carlos talk about the story from his father that finally made sense. And then we heard Savina talk about the motivation and courage that really inspired her to go forward again at the center of the story, of the narrative, to drive that movement forward. And then we heard all of our youth organizers talk about how at the center of this they've been able to sustain their faith for the long term. So as I think about these lessons and think about the great work that we have both the privilege and responsibility to do with all of our partners across the room, this couldn't possibly have been a better and more timely conversation to have. And so with that context, I want to pivot to our call to action. And once again, I'm going to look at David because our call to action is just so well aligned. And frankly, it's quite simple. On the one hand, we want to invite you to, if you have not done so already, we want to invite you to continue to invest in and in support funder collaboratives that are supporting youth organizing. So we were honored and privileged today to have grant makers concerned with immigrants and refugees here, and any affinity groups that are supporting youth organizing, we encourage you to be a part of. And at the same time, we want to encourage you to also, we want to encourage you to join issue-based affinity groups like grant makers concerned with immigrants and refugees, or join funder collaboratives such as the Funders Collaborative for Youth Organizing. And then finally, we are at an inflection point, as I mentioned earlier, and part of what we want to do without question is continue to support youth-led change. With the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund, we've always kept young people at the center of problem identification and solution design, to be sure. And as we double down on that, as we double down on civic engagement and supporting social movement going forward, we want to be in partnership with all of you. So with that, I encourage you to complete your evaluations. Please share your ideas with us. Tell us how, coming out of today, we can be in partnership with all of you to move this work forward. We love that ecosystem frame. It is exactly how we think about this network and how we approach this work. And so any ideas that you all have that we can also use to inform our work is going to be so critical to us. So if you haven't done so already, please, that's a plug for Sherry, that you complete the evaluation. And we look forward to building on the conversation, the dialogue, and this movement in partnership with all of you. I want to ask you, before we officially wrap up, to just one final time join me in thanking the Hyams Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and my colleague Sherry Brady and the Aspen Forum team. Please. And then just a friendly sort of invitation to you all is that we actually are going to have the opportunity to continue this conversation that's going to focus specifically on youth organizing in Boston tomorrow. So at the Opportunity Youth Incentive Fund convening, we're going to do a design studio session in partnership with the Hyams Foundation that's going to tell the story on local youth organizing, including the school to prison pipeline, push out, a lot of what we actually heard today, but we're going to have the opportunity to dive even deeper. So if you're with us, I certainly invite you to attend that session, and we hope that you are able to be with us over the next couple of days. We look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Just the evaluations will be emailed to you. They should be hitting your email shortly, as a matter of fact. So please fill those out. Thank you.